Hey, biology! We are here to talk about embryology and the animal kingdom as a whole. So we're going to talk about what it means to be part of the
Animal kingdom.
Nice. All right, so all animals share characteristics in common. So everything on this side that you can see is an animal, even if you don't necessarily think of it as an animal, right? So corals and sponges don't normally get thought of as an animal, but they really are. All animals are multicellular. They are eukaryotes, which means they have those membrane-bound nucleus and as well as membrane-bound organelles. They are heterotrophs, which means they cannot make their own food. They have to consume the food. And they do not have a cell wall. So remember, cell walls are specific for plants. So obviously we've got some pretty important ones like shark, bird, cute kitty cat, but this
that's
coral,
a cutie pie. It's really cute, like my dragon.
But the coral is also an animal, even though we don't necessarily think of it as one, as well as the sea slug there. In order for animals, there's a Luna, that's our Luna dog there. In order for animals to survive, they have to maintain what we call homeostasis. So their internal environment has to be very constant or stable, which is why it can be bad if you get sick and get a fever. Your fever gets too high, it will actually start to destroy your brain cells. That's why it's really important that you take Tylenol or something like that to lower the fever. So homeostasis is our big word. Right here, it just means maintaining a constant environment. And this works by feedback control. So if you get too hot, your body takes notice that the internal temperature is going up and you start to sweat, right? So when I go for my run on a hot day, even sometimes in the winter, if I've overdressed for that weather, I'm gonna be sweating because my body is getting too hot. If I get too cold, I'll shiver. So some examples are like if a dog gets too hot, they can't sweat, so they have to pant. Elephants, if they're too hot, they actually flap their ears. That's why elephants that live in Africa have those massive ears, because it gets so hot and their body is so big. The way that they can cool it down is by having those big ears and allowing the heat to get off.
Or they can get mud to cool them off.
Yes, Eli points out that they can also roll in the mud to help cool them off that way, which is very true. Reptiles, if they get too cold, have to go lay on a nice warm rock and sunbathe because they are not warm-blooded. They're what we call cold-blooded, so they don't get to maintain their internal temperature like we do. They have to use the environment to help heat them up or cool them down. Also, there's feeding and digestion that needs to occur, so you have to eat something, but then you also have to be able to absorb all those nutrients. So animals started out as filter feeders, like what coral is. Things can just filter through the cells and it traps what little nutrients it can and then absorb that way. And then it went to two-way digestion. So what that means is like a jellyfish, their mouth is also their anus. So everything that comes in gets digested and goes back out that hole. And then there's the one-way digestion. So it's the tube that we have, like you eat your mouth, poop out of your anus, right? So that is
disgusting.
Thank you. That is a one-way digestion, in and out. Okay. Respiration is being able to get that oxygen so your cells can do cellular respiration. And then you release the carbon dioxide, which is that byproduct of cellular respiration. This can happen through diffusion, just through the skin of an animal or the outer layer of an animal. It can happen through tubes or spiracles, which is what you would find in an insect. So they have small little holes along the side of the body. And as they move, the oxygen gets pulled in and the carbon dioxide, when the muscles contract, gets forced out. Then you have gills like in fish. And that's part of that, like as the water passes over them, it dissolves the carbon dioxide so that it takes it away from the gills and the oxygen goes towards the gills. And then you have lungs that you find in like birds, reptiles, mammals, things like that. The last thing that you need is circulation so that it can actually transport that oxygen, that much needed oxygen, all around the body. So again, that can happen through diffusion. If you are a worm, for example, this just happens through the skin of the worm. It diffuses in and out as it goes, and because it can diffuse along that whole length of the worm, it doesn't really need necessarily a circulatory system. You can have an open circulatory system where the blood just kind of sloshes around the whole body as it moves. So think insect there. It has what we call hemolymph. That's its blood, basically. And as the insect moves, the hemolymph gets distributed with that movement. Or you can have a closed circulatory system like in mammals, where we have a 4-chambered heart. The heart itself has actually evolved from basically one big pumping organism to something that has 2 chambers to something that has 4 chambers, to help separate and become more efficient with that oxygen and deoxygenated blood. So like in mammals, our oxygenated blood is completely separated from our deoxygenated blood.
Like me.
Yep. But in fish or in reptiles, it's not quite as sophisticated. It's either a 2 or a 3-chambered heart where that blood intermingles. So you have some oxygenated blood getting pumped into like the lungs and some deoxygenated blood getting pumped into the body because it's not completely separated. Excretion means that you have to be able to get rid of the waste. So as we know, when cellular respiration happens, there's a waste product that can be toxic to cells. So you have to get rid of that waste product. Again, in the most simple organisms, like your coral, it just happens by diffusion. You build up the waste, it diffuses because it has a high concentration on one side, low concentration on the other, so it'll diffuse out. Eventually what happens as you get more and more complex, so nephridia is what's found in insects. They're basically these tubes that go all along the body and get rid of the waste. And then you get tubules and finally kidneys. So our and mammal kidneys are very sophisticated and have a very high level of regulating not only like the ammonias in your blood, but also salt levels and things like that to make sure that you're staying at a very constant balance. Nervous system, or the response to stimuli, is also a very important thing, right? So if you get poked, you're going to respond to it because you're getting poked.
Do not tickle me or poke
That's
me.
the response to stimuli. So it started with just simple cells that were able to respond to something that happened in the environment. And then it went to a nerve net, like what you find in starfish. So there's like a nervous ring all around and extending down the arms. Same thing with your flatworms or platyhelminthes. And it becomes more complicated with ganglia, like in insects. There's a big central ganglia in the head that we would call the brain. But then there's also ganglia along each section that control that section independently of the brain, which is why you have that rumor that cockroaches can last without their head, because they don't have that centralized nervous system that we have. Their body is actually controlled segmentally. And then lastly, you have what we would call a brain, so something much more complex. Like in humans, we have a brain, the spinal cord, and then nerves that extend from the spinal cord, and it's all controlled by that central nervous system. Movement also had to be evolved so that at some point, every animal in their life has to move. This occurs through muscle tissue and contractions, if you're a sea creature, that means that you're pumping water in and out, or we have a skeletal system in the land environment. So insects, while they don't have an internal skeleton, have an external skeleton, so that exoskeleton, which helps provide that rigidity so that they can move. Reproduction also has to evolve. So there's, as you know, that asexual, where it's basically cloning. It's genetically identical to the parent. You can have hermaphrodites, which is most common in worms and flatworms, where it's both male and female parts. And then sexual reproduction that will produce offspring that is genetically different from the parent. So in the development of creatures, the more complex you are, the more usually stuff that's inside of you. So things started out with having really no head or tail, so think coral. And then you had cephalization, which is the creation of a head. So here we've got like a sea anemone and an insect. You can see that there's really no head or tail, but this clearly has a head and a back part. Diffusion, which occurs again in that coral or that sea anemone, just things moving in and out of the water as it goes through the sea anemone. It'll get trapped high concentration to low concentration. So your
Maybe
oxygen, your nutrients, all of that will just move in and out with that concentration gradient.
Can I tell a student something?
To cell specialization. So here you can see that it has an exoskeleton. Those cells are fundamentally different than the muscle cells on the inside, which are different than the eye cells, which are different than the antenna cells. They each have a role to play. To tissues and organs that get developed. So an insect does have the ganglia, which is kind of like their brain. It does have a stomach, which are those tissues, and then organ cells, that systems that work together. You get different types of symmetry that are being present. So things can be asymmetrical, radial symmetry, or bilateral symmetry, which I have an example of here. So asymmetrical means that it's just basically a colony of cells, like the coral, that kind of don't have any symmetry. You can't really cut it and find any sides that are the same. Radial symmetry are found in things like that sea anemone, where you can cut it really anyway because it's a circle and it's going to be symmetrical on each side. And bilateral symmetry means that you can only cut it along one plane to find that symmetrical side. All right, we're going to jump in to embryology in the next one.